Have you ever wondered if you could be the one exposed in a story you thought was just a simple misunderstanding? Grace Lewis, an ordinary woman, faced exactly that when she decided to call 911 about a strange man. But what happens when the man isn't the intruder, when she is the one being revealed? What would you do in that situation? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more shocking stories like this. It was an afternoon like any other. Grace Lewis sat by her window, an iced tea in hand, eyes fixed on the familiar street outside. Her neighborhood, a peaceful, tight-knit community, was not a place for disturbances. From her window, she could see every car passing by, every pedestrian walking along the sidewalk, and every little thing happening around her. She was used to this routine: quiet afternoons, friendly neighborly conversations, and the comfort of a place she had lived in for years. But today was different. Grace watched as a gray SUV slowly turned onto her street. The man driving it was unfamiliar, and he parked in front of the vacant house next door, a place that had been empty for months. A strange feeling crept over her. She squinted, carefully observing his every move as he stepped out of the car. No uniform, no identification, just a plain blue sweater and jeans. He looked ordinary, but why was he here? His steps made Grace uneasy. He didn't seem rushed. He walked with purpose, as if he belonged there. Then he pulled out a key and unlocked the front door. A quiet fear started to build inside her. Was he the new owner? But if so, why hadn't there been a for sale sign? And if he wasn't a real estate agent, then what was he doing there? The questions swirled in her mind, fueling her unease. Was she overreacting? Or was her instinct telling her something real? Grace felt a responsibility to do something. Hesitating, she reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Should I call 911? She didn't want to cause unnecessary trouble. But if she did nothing, who else would? As she made the call, her heart pounded. I'd like to report a man entering a vacant house on my street. I don't think he's supposed to be there, she told the dispatcher. Part of her felt guilty, but another part felt relieved. She was doing the right thing. Minutes later, the sound of police sirens filled the air. Her pulse quickened as she watched from a distance. Officers approached the man. Tension tightened in her chest. And then, the twist. The man wasn't arrested. He wasn't even questioned. Instead, he calmly handed over paperwork. A cold chill ran down Grace's spine. A sinking realization crept in. Had she made a mistake? Had she been too quick to jump to conclusions? As the police signaled for the man to continue on his way, Grace felt her world shift. Had she been wrong all along? Had she overreacted, creating an unnecessary scene? And worst of all, would anyone see the truth behind her actions, or would they only see a woman blinded by irrational fear? Grace's unease lingered as she stood by the window, her eyes fixed on the man. His figure disappeared behind the gray SUV, but the knot of anxiety in her chest only tightened. She should have been calm, but a strange feeling, an unshakable sense of unease, made her feel like things were slipping beyond her control. Never had she thought that something so small in her neighborhood could leave her feeling so unsettled. Had she been too quick to call 911? Was she imagining things? And yet, her mind refused to let go of the worst possibilities. The man wasn't a delivery worker. There was no for sale sign, no indication that he had any right to enter that vacant house. And when he used a key to open the door, a sharp tension, like a taut string about to snap, rang through her mind. Her chest felt heavy. She could have ignored it, let it pass like any other ordinary day. But she didn't. Something felt wrong, and she had to act. If I'm wrong, I'll take responsibility, she thought. But it didn't stop her from worrying. Everything had changed the moment she made that call. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was doing something truly important, yet she was terrified of the consequences. As the distant sound of police sirens echoed through the street, a wave of adrenaline surged through her. A patrol car pulled up next to the SUV. Her heart pounded harder. Her fingers gripped the window frame as if looking away for even a second would erase everything. She watched as two officers stepped out, approaching the man. They exchanged a few words, and then something unexpected happened. The man, whom Grace had assumed was an intruder, simply handed the officers a stack of papers. The officers nodded. No interrogation, no tension. They gestured for him to continue what he was doing, and in that moment, Grace felt the ground beneath her shift. The doubt she had carried so heavily now turned into undeniable shame. She had been wrong, but there was no way to take it back. The street fell silent. She watched as the man, the one she had called the police on, returned to the house and continued his work. No hesitation, no fear, no defensiveness. He was simply the new owner of the vacant home, a man beginning his new life in a neighborhood she thought she knew so well. Regret washed over her. Had she acted too impulsively? And if she had, how could she possibly explain her fears to those around her? She had lost her composure for just one moment, but the price of that moment was a hard lesson learned. Trust and perception in a community can change in an instant. What Grace had just experienced was more than just a misunderstanding. It was a wake-up call, a revelation about the way she viewed the world around her. A cold wave surged through Grace as the truth sank in. From the fog of anxiety and uncertainty, a suffocating realization took hold as she listened to the officer's explanation. The man she had assumed was an intruder, the man she had called the police to apprehend, was none other than the new owner of the vacant house, Matthew, a stranger to her, but not a trespasser. A simple misunderstanding, but one with irreversible consequences. A deep sense of discomfort wrapped around her. Every second that passed, she wrestled with the weight of her decision to call 911. How had she missed the obvious signs? He had entered with a key. Everything pointed to him having the right to be there, and yet her suspicions had taken control. Now that the truth had settled, she felt herself drowning in a sea of regret and shame. She stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Matthew, the man she had mistaken for a threat, stood calmly before her. He wasn't angry, he wasn't defensive. There was no tension in his posture, only the quiet ease of a new homeowner stepping into the next chapter of his life. And that was what she had failed to see. How could she have understood the whole story when she had only seen one piece of the puzzle? As the misunderstanding unraveled, the tension in her body slowly eased. But the shame and regret, they would not fade so easily. She had acted too quickly, too rashly, without taking the time to seek the full truth. Had she let fear drive her decision? Had she been too afraid of the unknown to see things clearly? She could have waited. She could have gathered more information before making a judgment. But she hadn't. And now she had to live with the weight of that choice. What had made her distrust this man? Was it the difference in his appearance? Or was it the mere discomfort of the unfamiliar in a neighborhood she thought she knew so well? She couldn't bring herself to say it aloud, but she felt it. This wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a lesson in rushed judgment, in lack of understanding, in the way we view others without truly knowing them. Matthew held her gaze for a long moment. There was no resentment in his eyes, just a small, knowing smile, as if he understood exactly what she was feeling, and that, more than anything, was what Grace couldn't ignore. A silent connection, one that couldn't be put into words, but was undeniably real. She couldn't deny the truth. Her impulsiveness had made things more complicated than they ever needed to be. This story didn't end with Matthew's explanation. It opened a door for Grace to look inward, to recognize that understanding and empathy take time and patience. The shame would fade eventually, but the lesson, that would stay with her forever. When Matthew looked at Grace, there was no anger in his eyes. Instead, there was a calmness, one she couldn't quite understand. The tension in the air was undeniable, yet it was nothing like she had expected. As Grace stood there, frozen in place, shame and confusion weighing heavily on her, Matthew remained still, seemingly unfazed, prepared to face whatever challenge she might present. The once quiet neighborhood had become the backdrop of a confrontation no one had anticipated. Grace's heartbeat thundered in her chest as Matthew finally spoke. His voice was deep, steady, but strong. "I've seen you watching me, Grace," he said, his tone slow and deliberate, making everything around them fall silent. "You think no one noticed, that you could observe me without anyone knowing, but I've seen you stare at my house every afternoon, watching me from your window, as if I were some outsider who didn't belong here." His words hit like a shock wave. Grace hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. A mixture of fear and humiliation washed over her. She had believed she was the one in control, the one protecting her neighborhood. But now she realized Matthew had been aware of her all along. He hadn't just noticed her presence. He had seen through everything. The illusion of control crumbled around her. Matthew wasn't clueless about her suspicions. He had known, and now, standing before her, he was holding up a mirror she couldn't turn away from. Yet, his expression remained unreadable. There was no anger, no accusation, only disappointment, a quiet, almost sorrowful resignation, as if he had hoped for something different. "I'm not a stranger, Grace. I'm the new owner of this house. I have every right to be here. I've done nothing wrong," he said. "But you saw me as a threat. You called the police instead of asking questions. Why?" His voice was steady, unwavering, not confrontational, but challenging nonetheless. And in that moment, everything changed. Grace had no response. How could she justify what she had done when he had already seen the truth? He didn't have to accuse her of anything, because she already knew. She had misjudged him, not because of anything he had done, but because of what he looked like. "You watched me because I'm a black man," he continued, his voice even, not angry, but painfully aware. Grace's shame deepened. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was realization. A realization that this wasn't about safety. It had never been about protecting her community. It was about fear, a subconscious bias she hadn't even recognized within herself. In that single moment, she saw everything differently. She hadn't just damaged her relationship with Matthew. She had shattered her own trust in herself, and that was a far deeper wound. But Matthew didn't stop there. His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "I don't blame you," he said. "You did what you thought was right. But sometimes we need to look deeper before we judge." Then he turned away, but his words lingered, etching themselves into Grace's mind, forcing her to confront a truth she could no longer ignore. How could she go on pretending to be above it all? Could she change? Could she face her own mistakes? Or would she continue living in the same fear and doubt? The question loomed over her, unanswered. But one thing was clear. Her relationship with Matthew would never be the same. The silence in the neighborhood felt like a thick net, trapping Grace in a room with no windows. The glances, the whispers, the stolen looks from her neighbors tightened around her chest like a vice. She had once taken pride in being a part of this community, someone who cared about the safety of their neighborhood. But now everything had changed in an instant. Shame and humiliation clung to her. She could feel the shift in how people saw her. It was like a sharp blade, slowly slicing through her sense of self-worth. Ever since Mata shared the video, everything had fallen apart. A video she had never anticipated, capturing moments she thought were harmless, her lingering glances through the window, her careful, almost secretive steps past his house, her watchful, subconscious surveillance, now laid bare, turned into a weapon that had made her the target of judgment. In the footage, she saw herself walking past Mathay's house every day, staring, observing, like a stranger lurking. Every frame had been pieced together with precision, exposing her actions for what they truly were. Her heart pounded in her chest, a suffocating mix of regret and sorrow swelling inside her. She watched herself being scrutinized by the very community she had once cherished, the same neighbors she had spent years building relationships with. They no longer looked at her the same way. She felt exposed, isolated, every passing glance, every hushed conversation. Each moment felt like she was falling further away from the place she once belonged. This shame wasn't just about what she had done, it was about what was real. Grace couldn't deny that she had been wrong, but what hurt more than anything was the isolation. The realization that the people she had trusted were turning away from her. She had believed herself to be a good person, someone who cared for her community. But now she understood. Her perspective had never been as clear as she thought. She had worked to protect this neighborhood, but she had ignored the feelings of others. She had overlooked what she couldn't see. What shook her the most was seeing those she had once called friends quietly step away. The invitations stopped. The friendly glances disappeared. Something had changed. And now, Grace felt like a stranger in the very place she had called home. Could she fix this? Could she rebuild the trust that had been lost? She felt like she was drowning, trapped in a darkness she didn't know how to escape. And as she thought about the video Mathe had shared, she realized it wasn't just a recording. It was a painful reminder of the blind spots in how she saw others, the biases she had never recognized. Could this be repaired? Could she ever regain what she had lost? It felt as if a shell was slowly being stripped away from Grace, exposing a loneliness she had never imagined. She had once been an integral part of this community, someone who participated, helped, and nurtured relationships with her neighbors. But now, the weight of ostracization made her feel like she was losing herself. Everything had changed in an instant. The way people looked at her had transformed her into an outsider, someone who no longer belonged. Gone were the friendly glances. Gone were the polite nods as she passed by. Now the greetings were cold and distant, if they came at all. Every step she took through the neighborhood she once loved felt heavier, as if she were walking against an invisible force pushing her away. The invitations stopped. The once warm gatherings excluded her name. The people she had once called friends now turned their backs, looking at her as if she were a stranger. The pain of being shut out was unbearable. Grace tried to explain herself, to regain even a shred of respect, but no one wanted to listen. Did they remember the times she had been there for them? Or had those memories been swallowed by the silence and rejection? She thought of the laughter, the shared stories, the moments that had once defined her place in this community. But now, all that remained was an emptiness she couldn't escape. Once again, she found herself on the outside, looking in, and that realization crushed her. She wanted to say something, to explain herself, but the words choked in her throat. No matter what she said, she knew things could never go back to the way they were. This community, these people she had once loved, were now ghosts in her eyes. Then something happened that she couldn't stop thinking about. That morning, when she walked into the grocery store, she ran into Bethany Moore, once a close friend, now just another distant face. There was a strange silence between them. Bethany only gave a small, unreadable smile before walking away without a word. And that moment shattered something inside Grace. She wasn't part of this neighborhood anymore. When she returned home, she saw it, the faint glow of Matthew's car headlights. He stood there watching her, not with anger, not with confrontation, just silence, an unspoken acknowledgement between them. And in that moment, everything that had unraveled felt irreparable. Had she lost everything? Could she ever make things right? Or had she destroyed the life she had spent years building? The unanswered questions clawed at her mind. She knew she couldn't change the past. But was there any way to start over? Or was it too late? Grace wanted to believe in redemption. She wanted to believe there was a way forward. But the silence between them only made the weight of her doubts heavier. Grace stood in her kitchen, a cup of cold coffee in her hands, staring out the window. The trees swayed in the wind, mirroring the unease in her heart. The looks from passers-by, the murmurs from her neighbors, they were no longer filled with concern. Now they carried doubt, distance, like a stain spreading through the community, one that she couldn't wash away. And with each passing day, that stain grew darker. When the whispers turned to rumors, when Matthew's video of her surveillance was shared beyond their street, everything spiraled out of control. People she once considered friends had completely turned away. But things were only getting worse. She saw it in the numbers, the value of her home, her sanctuary, the place she had built her life in, was plummeting. Her once proud home was no longer seen as a respected part of the neighborhood. She was losing everything. But it wasn't just the financial loss. The community itself was shifting under Matt's influence. Under his leadership, people began questioning the Homeowners Association, HOA. How had this neighborhood been managed? How had homes been bought and sold in the past? Their scrutiny intensified. They searched for weaknesses in the system, and all eyes turned to Grace, as if she were responsible, as if she had been the one holding back the community. Matthew wasn't just exposing the truth, he was leading a movement, and that movement had shaken the foundation of everything. The HOA meetings grew heated, the debates louder. People demanded transparency, answers, accountability. And at the center of it all, Grace was seen as part of the bigger problem. She felt powerless. Everything she had built, the relationships, the trust, was crumbling. In one moment she had lost control. Now she was being blamed for the fall of an entire community. Her chest tightened. Could she fix this? Or was it already too late? The same unanswered questions gnawed at her, and every time she saw the faces of her former neighbors, now distant, now cold, she felt herself inching closer to the edge. Rain began to fall against the window, each drop a reminder of mistakes that couldn't be undone. But was there still hope? As she struggled with her thoughts, a familiar figure appeared. Matthew, standing at the end of the street. His expression was no longer defiant. There was no accusation in his eyes, just silence, a different kind of silence, one that held something uncertain. Was this her last chance? Or was the past too heavy to escape? As Matt looked into Grace's face, a wave of hesitation surged within her. For days, she had been unable to escape the tension, the suspicious glances, the hushed whispers throughout the neighborhood. The image of Matthew, the black man she had once deemed suspicious, had now become a symbol of resilience against racial bias. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had become the enemy in her own community. Everything she had believed to be right, The actions she had thought were for the protection of her neighborhood had only revealed an underlying prejudice she hadn't even realized existed within herself. Matthew, the man she had once called a stranger, had now become a figure of strength, not just for himself, but for the entire neighborhood. His silence in the face of judgment had transformed into a powerful reminder of justice and equality. He had never retaliated. He had never pointed fingers or lashed out in anger. Instead, he had allowed his story to speak for itself, awakening those around him to reflect on their own biases. He had become a leader, a voice for those who had been judged for nothing more than their differences. And Grace? She stood there, a lump forming in her throat, unable to ignore the reflection of herself staring back at her. She had always seen herself as a good citizen, someone who fought for safety and upheld the values she had believed to be right. But now she understood. Her actions had contributed to the very system of exclusion she had never thought herself a part of. She had created a divide between herself and others without ever realizing it. And now, as the neighborhood slowly began to recognize Matthew as a symbol of resilience and justice, Grace knew what she had to do next. Could she still stand in this community? Could she change the way she saw the world, and in doing so, help others recognize their own unconscious biases? She no longer felt self-righteous. Instead, remorse filled her chest, but so did a flicker of hope. She wasn't a bad person, but she no longer wanted to live in ignorance. She knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but perhaps this was her moment to face the truth and step out of the shadow of her own mistakes. Because sometimes, only when we truly recognize our own failures can we begin to change. The reality of what had happened wasn't just a lesson for Grace, it was a lesson for everyone who had witnessed it. Because sometimes, what we believe to be right is nothing more than a reflection of a much deeper, unspoken flaw. Biases cannot simply be erased, but by acknowledging them, we can begin the journey toward real change. Grace stood there, staring at her reflection in the window, her vision blurred by regret. Her chest felt heavy as the truth she had long refused to acknowledge crashed down upon her. For months, she had seen herself as the protector of her neighborhood, but she had never realized that the very actions she believed were harmless had been driven by deeply ingrained racial biases. She hadn't just been protecting a community. She had been trying to preserve a world she failed to recognize was built on exclusion. When Matthew became a symbol of resilience against racial prejudice, the shift within the community became inevitable. Every glance, every whisper, every hushed conversation circled back to her. The neighbors who once supported her now looked at her differently, as if she were an intruder in her own home. To them, she was no longer a friend, a colleague, or a neighbor. She was part of the problem, a reflection of the very prejudice she had once failed to see in herself. That realization hit her like a brutal slap to the soul. She had acted out of a sense of protection, but it had been the wrong kind of protection. And now, standing there, looking at Matthew, the man she had once labeled a stranger, she saw someone stronger, someone who had embraced change while she remained frozen in her own ignorance. Shame, helplessness, the weight of it pressed down on her. How could she face the people who had witnessed her mistakes without feeling the sting of her own guilt? The hope she had once held on to now felt like a dark cloud looming over her. Could she change? Would the community ever see her differently after everything that had happened? But perhaps the worst realization of all was that change had to start from within. She could no longer hide from what she had done. Her actions had been a reflection of something far greater than herself, an ingrained societal flaw she had never questioned. And now, As everything crumbled around her, Grace understood that she could no longer live in the illusion she had built. She had to face the truth. She had to face herself. And most of all, she had to face the community, the very people who would never look at her the same way again. From now on, nothing would be the same. The neighbors she once saw as allies would now meet her with cold, distant stares. The ending to this story isn't just about Grace confronting racial bias. It is about the journey of awareness, about the transformation that comes when one is forced to reckon with their deepest, most uncomfortable truths. Because sometimes, only when we are confronted with our greatest mistakes do we truly begin to change. But does Grace have the strength to start over? The story slowly reaches an ending that no one could have predicted. The once peaceful life in this community had shattered like a perfect painting crashing to the ground. As Grace looked back on everything, she wondered, had she created an illusion of perfection in her mind, only to watch it all collapse around her? But the truth, like light at the end of a tunnel, had finally been revealed. The shock still lingered as she met the eyes of those who had once been her friends, colleagues, and neighbors. She had failed to realize that her actions, despite coming from good intentions, were driven by unconscious biases she had never acknowledged. And when Matthew stood before the community, facing their silent stares, he did not hesitate to expose the injustice and racial bias that many refused to see. In that moment, Grace understood something she had never considered before. Sometimes the ones being exposed are not the people we expect, but those who have the courage to face the truth and change. She no longer felt anger or shame, only regret. Regret for not seeing the truth sooner. Regret for allowing unseen prejudices to influence her actions. A sense of helplessness swelled inside her, but she knew that she could not change the past. What she could do, however, was confront the truth, learn from it, and grow. She now understood that respect is not something given freely. It is something earned. It is something built through one's actions. Matthew had taught her a powerful lesson. Respect is the real power. It is not a power that can be forced upon others or maintained through control. Real power lies in understanding, resilience, and the ability to face the truth, even when it is painful. Matthew had not only confronted racial bias, but he had used the power of truth to change this community. And while all eyes had once scrutinized him, he had remained steadfast, standing as a symbol of resilience and truth. As Grace reflected on everything she had done, she realized that she was not the only one who needed to change. The entire community needed to change. People had to confront the prejudices they had long ignored, even the ones they were unaware of. Because the truth will always come to light, whether we want it to or not. And in this case, the one being exposed was not Matthew, but the unspoken biases and flawed thinking that had existed in this community for years. This was a lesson in power and respect, about how one's actions shape the way the world perceives them. Grace's actions, even though they had stemmed from a desire to protect, had reflected a deeper societal issue she had never seen before. Now, she would have to learn how to stand firm in her truth, to rebuild the respect she had lost, not just from the community, but from herself. This story carries a profound lesson about awareness and respect within a community. Sometimes, even actions rooted in good intentions can reveal hidden biases that we fail to recognize. In life, respect is not something easily demanded, but something cultivated through understanding and patience. Grace, who initially believed she was protecting her neighborhood, had come to realize that unconscious bias and rash decisions can have unforeseen consequences. The greatest takeaway from this story is that each person must reflect on their own actions, learn to confront the truth, and open their hearts to differences. And most importantly, true power does not lie in control or dominance, but in facing and accepting the truth, even when it reveals what we wish to ignore. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.